smettetela di lamentarvi. Smettetela di chiedere che vi facciano un partito, che vi facciano un movimento, che vi facciano la rava, la fava. Fatevelo.
Serve un trauma, serve una presa di coscienza, serve un qualcosa che scuota.
Coraggio intellettuale di accettare la realtà dei fatti.
Senti, ma quanto va avanti sta roba qui?
Finché non c'è una bella sveglia. E chissà quando arriva la bella sveglia.
Sia mai detto che io mi perdo una battaglia persa. Eccoci qua, buongiorno, anzi buongiorno, giorno a John, buon pomeriggio Alberto e buon quel che sarà a chi ci guarda.
Buongiorno, ciao a tutti quanti.
Ciao John.
Oh, I was trying to check the microphone of my colleagues. Allora, John Cochrane è un economista che ho conosciuto nel lontano 1986 quando eravamo entrambi a Chicago. Poi lui ci è rimasto, io me ne sono andato, poi è andato a Stanford e ogni tanto ci si incrocia. John è molto attivo, oltre che accademicamente, anche nel tipo di dibattiti che piacciono a me. Lui li fa debating with his American colleagues, I do it more with my Italian one. Niente da fare, sono rimasto un po' italiano, nonostante le partenze. John ci raggiunge dalla sua casa di Stanford, Alberto credo che sia nella sua casa di Imola invece.
Di Bologna.
Ah, sei a Bologna. Bene, allora il tema di oggi è tariffe in generale. E per introdurlo, tariffe che in italiano dobbiamo chiamare dazi, scordandoci ci sono le tariffe doganali, we call them tariffs. Ok, adesso switch to English because me too, I can't, I have troubles to keep Italian on this matter. So please put up with us. Quindi credo che ci sarà la traduzione by artificial intelligence, so at least we get that. Well, let's give the word to our guest. John, how do you see the situation? We seem to be flipping again on China today.
Yes, well, chaos.
That was I used to be expert of that.
Yes, that's right. Well, chaos poorly described by mathematical theories of chaos. Tariffs seem to be, they are an answer in search of a question, at least here. And that's, I think, part of the chaos. The answer is always the same, tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. And the questions keep changing. Are we here to negotiate our way to global free trade? Are we here to beat up on China? Are we here to bring 1950s manufacturing back to America? Who knows what the goal is? And I think there was some sort of, this is Trump, he's a wonderful negotiator and so forth. But I don't think there's any explanation now but just chaos in how they're forming these policies day by day.
Well, I tend to give the floor to my friend Alberto, because let me tell you, you probably know, but on the tariffs as with respect to China, Alberto and I have very different opinions. As not completely orthogonal, but I would say they certainly would span the full space even. And so let's see what Alberto's view is, what's going on currently of the overall plan. I tend to agree that it's chaos and it's not clear what they're after. But okay, here is the word. Dottor Porchielli, prego.
No, it is chaos. I mean, now it seems like today he has announced a reduction in the tariffs on China. They were applied, they were declared, they were like announced. I don't know what to say. Not even a week ago, and now they're already too high.
Well, they are too high.
I know, but they could figure it out a week ago.
Well, one good thing you got to say about Trump is he will back down when he sees something is catastrophically dumb, like 150% tariffs on China and
didn't
10%
he announce
tariffs everywhere.
1,000 something on some items?
Yeah, basically a no trade, which is, the one thing worse than tariffs is banning trade. So
Yeah,
at least we're not going to do that.
But let's try to understand what. So I think we have no doubt that what's going on is insane and true. Trump backed down when he sees disaster. At least he has that survival instinct. Even if I have to say, I've seen few people in position of power like that to push the envelope up to the point at which he does. I mean, Putin is doing it on the other side, but I mean, we're talking about another animal and another environment. And so let's try to put some economics into it. John, let's assume that, let's try to put some reasonable sense. So assume one wants, which is the only argument in my opinion that holds some water, to do something because there is a US, let's just take US, lack of manufacturing bases in what we call strategic, militarily strategic or security strategic or certainly security relevant sectors, and in which there is a feeling that because of lack of trust toward China in particular, I don't know why we never add Russia to that list, but that's okay. But hey, whatever. The US, let's just take, as I said, the pure US position, ignore Europe for a moment, want to do something. So we want to create incentive for our manufacturing industry, for our entrepreneur, for our scientists, to do those things in such a way that we stay ahead of the potential competitor or potential enemy. What's your take on that? And then let's listen to
so this is the great puzzle of tariffs. The right answer, we're all economists, is unilateral free trade. That's the thing that makes the US best off. And then that's fairly easy to explain. And then you have to spend another hour on the 100 whatabouts. What about this? What about that? And slice away different fallacies on that question. So certainly that is the most plausible argument. But wait a minute, if that is the question, the current tariffs are not the answer. So there's 100 reasonable questions. And if you say these are the questions and say, what's the right policy for that question? You do not come up with it. So tariffs on Europe, 10 or 20% tariffs on Europe. What's that got to do with national security, manufacturing in China? Tariffs on Mexican avocados, something I particularly enjoy an imported good of here in California. What's that got to do with national security and manufacturing in China? So, the fact that there might be one reason for one tariff does not mean that all tariffs are good. So let's just be careful about the argument. So you actually brought up two questions. One is bring back manufacturing. The other is specific kinds of things that have to do with national security relative to China. And actually brought up a third, staying ahead. So those are three reasons given for tariffs. They also each have different answers when you get to the question. It is not true that America's manufacturing is dead. We've moved to higher value manufacturing. We export services. It is much more fun to sit behind a computer all day than it is to sit on an assembly line screwing in pieces of iPhone. And nobody in the US likes to do that anymore. Even if you have national security and manufacturing and so forth, that does not say, why is it bad to import bicycles from China? I, by the way, want to buy, I'm shopping for a bicycle for my wife, and the idea of paying 3 times as much for it is not something I'm at. What does that have to do with, national security related manufacturing, our ability to produce F-35? There's nothing to do with it. So beware of this, well, there's some tariff somewhere that might make sense, so tariffs are good kind of argument. If you want to do national security, I think we need to be much more precise about what the national security fear is and how the alleged policy is going to help it. Just general, we need more manufacturing, so we'll bring it back even if it costs 3 times as much to do it inefficiently in the US as China. That adds up to being very expensive And there's a tendency in trade to wrap everything in the flag. I've watched many trade cases. Every industry running to Washington for protection wraps it in the flag and says, oh, we need to produce more goose down for American national security. Yes, there was actually a goose down national security case. I worked on it when I was
Yeah. Well,
just ridiculous. So let's talk narrowly about exactly what do you want to do. We are not going to refight World War II. It is true, our shipbuilding capacity in the US is down to nothing, thanks to tariffs and protectionism. We protected the industry to the point that the industry is completely down to zero. We barely don't make ships anymore. We are not so tell me what the security scenario is for the conflict with China, where we have to build ships in the US in order to fight something that looks like World War. I mean, that's not going to happen. If it really is security, then my answer is put it on the defense budget. If we want to do something expensively and inefficiently in the US, because it's vital for national security, I'm an economist. Tariffs are expensive, but aircraft carriers are expensive. So I don't say don't build aircraft carriers because it's expensive. I say, well, let's do cost benefit. So tell the generals, you can have a chips plant for $100 billion that produces, chips at high cost, better than we can. Okay, if you think chips are important, or you can have 10 aircraft carriers. Which do you want? $100 billion for chips, $100 billion for 10 aircraft carriers? Up to you. But make those trade-offs intelligently. I think that's the right answer to the national security. Let's be clear. What is the scenario we're trying to protect against? What exactly is a particular industry going to do for national security? And then let's evaluate the costs and benefits. There are costs relative to other important things for national security. Staying ahead of China, you brought that up. So this is something I fight all the time. Now we're into win the economic competition with China by our import substitution, protection, rebuild up something in the US. This is a strategy that has never worked. The mercantilist infant industry build up something to win a export competition with China. That's what the Argentines tried under Perón and up until 2 years ago. And that doesn't work. It's what India tried for 50 years. It doesn't work. So winning an economic competition by our leaders protecting industries. You protect industries in the US, what they do is they get very good at demanding more protection. Sorry, a mouthful.
Well, let's see the strategic. Okay, caveat. Unfortunately, on this, I know that I agree with John, in particular on the fact that I don't ever see any reason to use strategic or defense argument to support, justify, introduce trade restrictive practices. Military security has to be evaluated on the basis of.
No, there is an argument for narrowly targeted, specifically. What is the scenario? What's the target? How is this actually going to help security?
No,
we import avocados from Mexico. National security, got to stop that. What happens in the war when we can't have guacamole on our tacos and our boys won't be able to fight? No, come on, that's ridiculous.
But let me hear what Alberto says on this, because Alberto is concerned instead about that some kind of infant industry argument, I suppose, and so I want to hear it from him.
John, there are, of course, I agree with you, because everything is done in such a chaotic way that it doesn't make any sense. And why tariff on Europe? Why tariff on Mexico? Why tariff on Canada? What does that have to do with national security and so on? Regarding China, I think I have an issue with China because, first of all, in many cases, there are crucial elements of the military supply chain that get sourced from China, which is not a good thing. For example, China manufactures 100% of drones. The total market for drones, in the commercial drones I'm just talking about, is controlled by China. it can't be that the U.S. Army supplies drones from China. They have to find a different source of supply for drones. There are motherboards for the submarines get supply from China. There was a scandal time ago. Motherboards were supplied from China. That cannot happen. If the U.S. wants to be
What happened?
I think the Chinese hacked into poor Alberto's internet connection.
Yeah, Alberto's connection are often dancing.
Well, we can take up the issue right there because he said enough.
Yeah, I mean the issues seem to be always the same.
Me.
Yeah, I'll let you do it, but the issues seem to be the same. Security arguments have to be treated as such. Military defense,
and very narrowly.
We do nuclear submarines, and I suppose all the key components of nuclear submarine we do them in house. They cost 5 times as much as they would cost otherwise, notoriously, including the toilet seat. Famously, you remember that?
Yes,
that was as good. That came up with Reagan, if I remember right. That was I remember being very young when that came up.
It's not so. There's a security risk. You obviously don't want the Chinese hacking into the motherboard of the submarine. But again, we're a long way from 150% tariffs on bicycles for that one.
Yeah.
The Chinese, they're good at drones because they got better at stuff. The Chinese are darn good at a lot of stuff. They make electric vehicles at very good ones for very low prices that somehow don't save the climate in Europe or the US.
I want to go on that in a moment, in fact.
Yeah, we'll get there in a moment. But so these are now, but it is interesting how hard it is to separate us all out. I mean, China is now restricting exports of rare earths to the US. Now, again, there's a scenario where our imports of rare earths constrain the ability of F-35s to fly is a scenario of a very, very, very long war. And I hope we are not having a shooting war that lasts long enough that supply matters. That's another example of wrapping stuff in the flag. You can stockpiles are a very good solution to imported things. And those are, why don't we make these things in the US? Why don't we have rare earths in the US? Because it takes 10 to infinity years to get the permits to open a rare earth mine in the US. Why don't we make drones in the US? Well, look at the regulations it takes to establish a factory that does stuff like this. So in many ways, we have shot ourselves in the foot and producing stuff.
You're aware that US is a huge importer, manufacturer, and packaged drugs from Italy, right? In fact,
yes,
it's the second largest export from Italy to the US is actually packaged drugs.
Yes, and international trade is good. I also think we are jumping too quickly to fighting a war as opposed to deterring a war. We are not in a war with China. When you're in a war, you do things that really hurt you because they hurt the other guy more. You make worthless airplanes and send them over Germany to bomb the other guy. And it hurts you and it hurts them, and you lose, brave young men in doing it, but you're trying to hurt the other guy. That is not our current situation with China. I hope there's a strategic plan, which is how we get along and all prosper together, as opposed to, really hurt ourselves and try to hurt the other guy even more at the same time. That, by the way, you can't trade with China because it helps the Communist Party. If the strategy is we want to weaken China economically because there's some war coming, that is a hopeless strategy. North Korea has nuclear weapons. So the strategy would have to be weaken China to the point that its economy is worse than under Mao before you have some hope that is a national security strategy for confronting China. So lots of people say, oh, you can't do X because it helps China economically. That's not a sane strategy for fighting an actual strategic competition. Alberto, it looks like you're back.
Sorry. No, I think first we have to eliminate the supply of sensitive products from China. I don't know how many of them, but there are some. The drones case is an incredible case.
Well, you can't. The way to eliminate the supply is to do it better at home.
Right.
No. To me, we could supply drone from Korea, for example. We could supply drone from from Mexico.
That's right.
That's a really good point. The security answer.
Let me get a moment into this.
Sorry.
Which is where we were heading with John just a moment before you came back. There is an assumption in this argument that says we are going to head to a war with China for sure. Therefore, I'd rather have it from Korea, as if Korea could not ever be a risk, or I don't know, Germany, Russia. I mean, where? Because for sure, those are friends. That's the very funny dominant view, and I don't understand what's the base for that is.
Well, in case of war with China, you mean?
You want a resilient source of supply. You want to be able to supply from many other cases, not just a shooting war, but in case China cuts off exports of something in order to try to play an economic war. What we're trying to do is not fight the shooting war, but be ready to be able to do it. Now, then there's the question, would the US ever do it? We're not willing to back up Ukraine. Are we really going to go, if China invades Taiwan, is the US really going to start a shooting war with a nuclear power 5,000 miles west of the US over that? I mean, our credibility is shot, not just because, they're supplying some part to us. Is the credibility of the US to do something like that not lost in Ukraine, in Syria, in Libya, all over the world?
Yeah, John, let's separate the military
consideration
from the economic consideration.
Because these tariffs are not military tariffs. That's clear.
No, for example, we have to make an example. We have to make a case, whether it is shipbuilding, it is drones, it is something. But the possibility of a war with China is there. Whether you think it could be
you need a sensible strategy for that. But let's take shipbuilding. The U.S. passed a thing called the Jones Act.
Let Alberto finish.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the possibility of a war is there with Korea. It could be a stupid war, but the possibility of war is there. In case of a war, I think the U.S. has to be able to supply the goods either from inside or from friendly countries.
Yeah, if you want to prepare for a shooting war with China, we need a bigger defense budget. Obviously, we need to buy smart things, probably more drones, and so the answer to that is in the defense budget. It's not in tariffs around the world.
Well,
and let's just get away from this narrow, how do you do national security, which the U.S. has been terrible at. We killed our shipbuilding industry, protecting it so we would have it for national security under the Jones Act. So those kinds of subsidies don't tend to work in the U.S. But yes, need a military case. But if you are going to get into a competition with China, you need allies, you need friends.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
You need a global, maybe what some people want, I don't want, is the idea of we have a global trading bloc with the US and our friends, and we try to isolate China. But then you need friends. So I think these tariffs are going to be, if they go into force, are going to be very damaging economically, more than most people think. Worse, politically, they're going to, I thought Trump was going to do a lot of good and did a lot of good right up until about a month ago. But that's once everything costs twice as much at Walmart and people are out of jobs, his support is going to crater. That's the end of getting anything done under Trump. And worse yet, foreign policy. We need friends. We've pissed off the Canadians. He looks like he's going to do the unimaginable and get the liberals reelected.
I think it's done.
Pissed off Europe.
I think it's a done deal.
And when we call up the world and say, China's blockaded Taiwan, we need your help. Europe, we need you to stop buying stuff from China because we all want to gang up on China and get them out of Taiwan. Europe's going to say, see you later. I'm trying to be polite, right? Because we pissed off the world. So it's a real foreign policy and political disaster as well as an economic one.
I knew John is a volcano. I've known the guy for a while, but I want to try to elaborate a positive position. So let me go back to Alberto. I'm going to play a very unusual role for me, which is the mediator, but not a mediator in a silly sense. I'm trying
we
to
need
see
a devil's advocate here.
What?
We need a devil's advocate.
There you go. So the issue here, there is a view. It's a view actually I don't share, but the two of you share it. So that there is a large positive risk of an actual war with China. I suppose you imagine over Taiwan. I don't see any other reason unless we decide to, I don't know, support the Russia in case the China wants a piece of Upper Mongolia back or things like that. So let me take your position, the one you seem to share. There is a high positive probability of a war with China. So the question is, and that is the main concern. So what strategy you want to use for that? Alberto, let's put it in the positive form. So then we'll send a recommendation to Donald Trump or something.
Well, the US has to be able to supply critical element from other countries, not necessarily from inside, from other countries that are necessarily friends that can ensure the supply. They are away from the theater of operations. So you should be able to buy drones from Mexico, for example. Not necessarily
military drones, not civil drones. What's the relation?
Because there are lots of drones that are dual use. The dominance of China, the commercial drone, make it that all the drones are made in China, basically. Apart from the very
suggesting that we should essentially have a policy of subsidizing a set of companies to start producing military equipment or potentially military equipment in countries other than United States. Is that the idea?
Possibly, yes. The China dominance of the commercial drone market is unacceptable from the military viewpoint.
But let's go beyond drones. But in general, so the view is let's.
Shipbuilding is another one. Shipbuilding is another one.
But I don't have the impression that the U.S. has such a weakness in controlling the seas.
No, but in case the ability of the U.S. to resupply ships is very limited.
So, if I may,
you believe in a war that will last a couple of years with China by exchanging nuclear weapons?
Where we still have
the war gets nuclear, you don't worry about all these things. But if we can,
that's what I was thinking.
I mean, Michele, se ci tira le bombe atomiche, allora smettiamo di parlare di tutto, capito? Ma se non ce le tiriamo, hai bisogno di portare avanti una guerra convenzionale.
No, I understand, but I very much doubt that there is the possibility of a conventional war lasting more than 2 weeks involving U.S.
That's what
the U.S. Navy.
That's what everyone said. That's what everyone said in 1914 as well. But let's be clear.
Let's see what John thinks about it.
First of all, our objective here is to deter a war, not to intentionally provoke it. If you want to have the ability, and you need the credibility to be able to fight a conventional war, that's how you stop it from going nuclear. You go nuclear when you're going to lose conventionally. You need the military resources to fight the war, and you need the will to use them. Now, the number one problem with military resources in the U.S. is not lack of drones. Yes, China has a great thing, but we don't have aircraft carriers, we don't have airplanes, we don't have missiles, we ran out of artillery shells. So the number one thing you want to do is a big increase in your military spending on the stuff including high-tech drones. You want to buy them from China and you want to disassemble them and figure out how they work. Because the nature of this dual use is the constant innovation that goes on for the domestic one helps the military. But this is not going to be, if it comes to shooting, it's not going to be just fought on drones. It's going to be fought on the other stuff. There's also
an example. I'm being specific to make one example. I don't mean the war is going to be fought only on drone. I'm just making an example. You need a lot of things in the case. You need. Well, let me step back for a minute. The fact is,
your shipbuilding example is a great one because we recognized in 1920 that the U.S. needed to build ships in the event of a long war. We passed protections on them, tariffs. We passed a law called the Jones Act that says You may not transport things between ports in the U.S. except on U.S.-built, U.S.-manned ships. And the result has been a disaster. That's what killed the shipbuilding industry. And it all moved to Korea and China. We do not build commercial ships anymore. So that's what protection and tariffs do for you. You have to be smart about how you do it. But I think we got too much. We have Trump's tariffs, which are the great geopolitical thing in the world. We got off onto one tiny angels on the hair of the pin. How do we get drone capacity in the U.S.? That has almost nothing to do with the tariffs that Trump is announcing that are in danger of hurting the U.S. economically, politically, the global economy. We should get back to...
China got where it is by having 40 years of very high tariffs. China applied, up until WTO, China applied very high tariffs on anything. And that's how they built this extraordinary...
That's how they were poor. It was after, remember the WTO accession is what's accused of when China got incredibly rich by exporting stuff to us. China had high tariffs and produced Mao's economy. Even if China,
one at a time. I'm enjoying this totally, but one at a time.
Every country in the world with high tariffs is poor. India had high tariffs and import substitution, and we'll do it at home. Argentina, high tariffs, import substitution, we'll do it at home. Nowhere in the world does this strategy work for growing an economy.
Well, China applied high tariffs for a long time.
Yeah.
And it got to beat us. And it has an extraordinary capacity, it has 60% of the world capacity. And it all worked out with tariffs and industrial planning and many other things. And tariffs were part of the mix.
I think worked out despite tariffs and industrial planning.
Michele,
you look like you want to get in on this one.
No, I don't want to get into this because I have had this discussion with Alberto many times. I think my friend Alberto likes to refuse facts. Given that it turns out a bit, I read you, John, and I think we use the same data sources. So the data sources are the data sources. So I think that I'm just staying behind, enjoying the conversation. But I do remind Alberto, China joined WTO 25 years ago. And in the process of joining WTO, that is the 90s, they did lower progressively a lot of their market closure. State planning in China has been as successful as it has been in Japan and Korea. That is zero. The power of China comes from private enterprise. Yes, they had very high tariffs up to a point, but that's what John says. They were poor. They were damn poor. They were dramatically poor with tariffs.
Yeah, but without the tariffs, there wouldn't be a private enterprise market. They helped the private enterprise by applying tariffs.
So
if it wasn't for tariffs, China would not have an industry. I remember going to China, we had the beautiful products, and they said they're beautiful, but we can't buy them because once we apply the tariffs, they are too expensive. So what do you have to do? I negotiated so many joint ventures with them. They liked our generators, they liked our turbines, they liked our heater. But the fact is, they were too expensive because there were tariffs on them. So what did you have to do? You have to do a JV and manufacture inside. So the cost could go down. But by having a JV, you basically transfer technology and taught them how to do it. 20 years passed, and they're much better than us at doing the same thing that we were doing in the first place 20 years before. I mean, this is a fact. This is fact.
It's interesting that they got better. This is the problem of economics.
They got better because they're very, 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 very good people.
Individual companies are, would love to sell in China. Now, you're better off, but the economy as a whole does not do better by us imposing the same tariffs back again on China that they impose on us. It's, so you're shooting yourself in the foot a little bit by not.
I don't know, John. I mean, this is a statement you make. I'm basically saying that with 11% industrial GDP, the industrial GDP of the US is very low. Then there are many things that are not made in the US, that the military things outside of the from China, the country, of military war is there. The fact we supply 50% of the active principle for our antibiotics is a risk we can incur. Who even thought that we couldn't manufacture the mask for COVID? We couldn't even manufacture masks for COVID. You know why? Because the West didn't manufacture enough elastic. You understand? And we were dependent for that. I mean, if you assume, like I do, the country is a foreign, is an enemy, is not a friendly foe, is an enemy. And second, there's an actual risk of war, then you have to control your supply, and you have to make sure that you supply from friendly countries, because I still think there are friendly countries in the world that you can securely supply. Not necessarily you have to supply everything in the US. I'm not saying that. I'm making the case for friendshoring. And I think we have to be very specific. A tariff policy for China cannot be indiscriminate. They have to be very precise on precise items. But the rebuilding some capacity, whether in the US or in friendly countries, is a very, very good idea.
We need, which is why pissing off friendly countries is a terrible idea.
Oh, that was, but this is beyond the point. I agree.
And it's also why,
not even worth discussing it.
It's also why, but it has to be narrowly targeted. So tariffs on bicycles and sneakers, I think we'll get through the next war, without Chinese bicycles.
John, let's not discuss points we totally agree with.
Okay.
I mean, the strategy of putting tariffs on China did not really imply pissing off everybody else. That's not me. I didn't suggest that.
Okay, so there is, I think we've agreed now.
So now I want to step in. I want to step in with some data. Just give me a second, please. I want to step in with some data. Screen 2, here it is. I asked ChatGPT. And I checked. I know it's true. So yes, tariffs were high in China when they were poor. If we want, we can ask for EU average tariff protection.
Yeah, China's industrial policy, a good example is Mao's idea that everybody in China needed to make steel so we could beat the world at steel, and sent every villager home to make steel in his backyard. The results, I think, like 60 million people died of starvation. And that kind of industrial policy has a poor history everywhere. The hard fact of economics is, even if another country has tariffs, economically, you are better off with no tariffs. Even if another country subsidizes an export, and that feels very unfair to the domestic competitors of that export, you as a country are better off taking the gift from the taxpayers of China than you are ignoring that fact. We're just better off that way. Not doing that is very costly. And that's why I think, if you want to wrap things in national security, it has to be narrow, the costs tabulated, and really compared with the benefits and the alternatives. Maybe that $100 billion is better spent buying a zillion drones or aircraft carriers or things like that.
Then there is a larger case I want to make is, okay, thank you for this. Then there's a second case I want to make, which is considering the country, we think the US thinks that China is not a friendly country, okay? Which is more sort of an enemy, a competitor than a friendly country. I tend to agree with that, but some other people don't. It's okay. Life is beautiful anyway. If you really think that China is not a friendly country, does it make sense to supply 600 billion of goods from them? With so many friendly countries around the world, you could favor the manufacturing there and take away manufacturing. Why would you ever want to supply 600 billion worth of goods from your worst enemy?
Well,
why is that your worst enemy? Isn't that Russia your worst enemy?
No, I mean, generally, the US consider China to be his worst enemy.
Yeah, but the US may be wrong.
Well, what do you mean by
No,
competitor?
moreover, it's the US here, I don't know what
I
it
know,
means, because there are some guys in the US that have hysterical problems with China, which I actually think it's a mixture of racism
Oh,
and envy.
if you think China is a friend, then no
I don't
point
think
discussing.
China is a friend. I don't think China is an enemy. I think China is a competitor. It's a different object.
I think China is a bad competitor. I think China is an enemy, has to be controlled.
Right,
Now,
but
what
then,
do you mean by
no,
competitor?
let me try to put the argument on a different level. It boils down to a political and almost emotional or personal or cultural ideological evaluation if a country is a potential enemy or not. So let's agree to disagree, all right? Because we're not going to solve that.
The majority of
Let's
American
try
people
to think how we
that-
should set up our commercial and economic policies in circumstances such as this. Within a country, we have different views of who are the potential enemies, who are not the potential enemies, okay? And let's assume we can't solve those because they're based on complicated preferences, history, personal histories, and so on. The issue is, given that, and given that probably which country we consider a potential enemy or not may change as political majorities change. Is that really the way to go to shape our commercial and industrial policy according to this view of potential enemies? Do you really believe that makes sense?
Well, I also think we need to be clear. What do you mean by competitor? Or is it a competitor for who gets to export stuff? Or is it a competitor over specific strategic questions, mostly in the South China Sea? Even if you don't like China and you think they're a competitor in some vague sense, China put $600 billion, whatever the number, they work hard, they put stuff on container ships, they send it to us. We give them in return pieces of paper that we can default on anytime you want. And you're telling us that China got the better out of that deal? I would, if I were in China, I would say, I'm sitting on all these pieces of paper the US gave me in return for a generation of working in a sweatshop 12 hours a day. And am I ever going to get anything back? I mean, the point of those pieces of paper is the right for them to ask from us.
So far, American is honoring those pieces of paper.
No, we actually inflated away about 20% of their value. They're worth 20% less than they used to be.
Yeah, but they go up and down, you know that. You can't just claim they go, you know. But generally, the Chinese have been trading goods for assets. They've been buying U.S. assets.
And the assets are in the U.S.
This is the same argument that the Bush Senior had when some Japanese bank bought, at the time was the Security Pacific building downtown L.A. I was at UCLA back then. I said, so what? It's still downtown L.A. Exactly. They're not going to dismantle it and take it to Osaka. And in fact, they had to resell it a few years later, and somebody made a profit because they had to resell it at a lower price. So, I mean, I know we're not going to get out of this, but we're doing this for the people that are listening to us. This argument seems to be based on a perfectly legitimate, I mean, it's perfectly legitimate that people have, how can I say, an attitude of hostility toward the country. But it is just that. It reminds me exactly of the Japan obsession in the US that lasted all through the 80s and then ended in 93 when the Nikkei collapsed. And then all of a sudden, you know, the big enemy became a loser. But I repeat, the military part has a very simple solution, which is build your own military equipment, do your work. And then let's evaluate that on political means and cost benefit analysis.
We are past the military. We are past the military.
Right. We're past the military. The rest is sitting on an idea that the Chinese are bad guys.
Also, how much do you want to hurt the American economy in order to win this competition with China? Because that's what we're talking about. You know, the best way to, if you want to have a military confrontation or the credibility that if you wanted to, you'd have the ability, is to have the US economy grow like crazy by having the most efficient things you can possibly have, and then you can afford to have a big military.
I know,
If
I know,
we chill
John,
growth in the U.S. economy, then our military will look like Europe's.
But it's not going that way. It's not going that way. China has advanced technologically and dramatically, and is competing with the U.S. in every possible aspect all the way. That's not.
What do you mean by competing with the U.S.?
Can you tell me why that's such a bad thing?
Yeah, competition's good.
We can't really.
Why?
The majority of the American people think that China is an enemy.
Who cares? The majority of American people
I
also
happen
think
to
Trump
think
is
the
a good
same.
guy.
I mean,
They
I
also think
have
Trump is a good guy. An exit is not a drunkard alcoholic. So what?
I don't know so what, why, but the fact is, I happen to think that China is an enemy, that the Chinese system is not good for the world, that by having such a political and industrial might, the Chinese are spreading their power all over the world, which is not a good thing for the world.
So
I don't like the Chinese word. I don't like the Chinese word. I don't like that either, though.
China's a communist dictatorship, very unpleasant. I don't get what your strategy is. You want to basically put walls
I don't get my chance to talk.
Go for it.
I don't get my chance to talk. So China, I think, has to be contained. China has to be contained. I start from the assumption the Chinese word is not a nice word. Chinese are nice people. Singapore is Chinese. Taiwan is Chinese. Korea, if you want, they will get offended, but it's sort of Chinese. Malaysia is controlled by Chinese. Chinese are very smart people and are fairly good at what they do. And they don't need to be communists to control, to do good in the world. But the Chinese-fed communist system is not a good thing for the world. And especially it's not a good thing for my kids, it's not a good thing for me, and it's not good for democracy and freedom and a lot of other things. They're very expansionistic, they're very militaristic, they're very nationalistic, they're racist. I don't like them, okay? So I happen to fall in the field of the people who don't want them to get ahead. There are many elements to slow them down, possibly, even though I'm pessimistic about the probability of slowing them down. There are many things that will need to be done. They don't get done, they not necessarily get done. One of which is to try not to have them such a strong industrial position, because they derive a lot of power from the very strong industrial position. So trying to shift for the US to reserve 600, 700 billions of foreign trade to China in industrial goods is not a good idea. It possibly can suit friendly like Taiwan, friendly country like Korea, friendly and democratic country like Mexico, or something like that. That's the point I'm making. So tariffs is just a small piece of the puzzle. Because remember, the dictatorial system of China is the worst system you could possibly ever conceive.
Oh, there's worse. North Korea, Cuba.
I can find a bunch of much worse, but that's okay.
There hasn't been much worse. This is a perfection of a totalitarian system. It's a totalitarian system without flaw. It is people live miserably.
I don't have that impression. Forgive me, Alberto, but you're giving a description of China.
The first thing people want
strongly
to do
biased.
Is get out.
People in China, the majority seems to live decently well.
But that's
why it's dangerous. It's the only totalitarian system with a decent economy.
There's the difference between you and me.
No, but that's okay. But then there are facts.
If you think that China needs that system needs to prosper in the world, be my guest. I don't think it does, and tariff can help.
I actually have a very different view. Let me try to state my view. First of all, I do not think, and I think it's very anti-historical, to characterize the Chinese system as communist. It's an imperial system. It's an imperial autocratic system with a mandarinate that runs the country. And it's a essentially 21st version of what their empire system was in their high days of the 14th, 15th century. It's not even remotely communistic. There's nothing communist in China other than the funny name of the party that rules the thing.
But no, they do state planning.
But that's neither. But that's a label. That's a label. One thing I observe, having observed China for about 35 years personally, and having read about at least a century of its history, is that the process of economic growth has actually weakened the negative aspect of the Chinese system. Mass deportation, indoctrination, imprisonment, violence, and so on were much more frequent in China in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s than they are now. They have been progressively reduced. Now, am I an optimistic that thinks that everybody's going to become like England just because they reach the GNP per capita of income? No, I don't think so. I think there are cultural traits that last a very, very long time, which is why the crazy policy of exporting democracy and by invading countries and teaching them to be like California failed miserably and produced even worse results. And that's the problem we should face very coldly, very rationally with China, not emotionally. Yes, I'll give you the word in a second, but I want to state my view. I don't think that there is a point of exporting the China imperial system. Nobody wants to do that. It's a game. It's an historical game between two very big civilizations. And the question is, which one has more fuel? If we think that we can beat the Chinese model, the imperial Chinese model, by restricting them and attacking them, I think we're going to make half of the 2/3 of the world their friend, and we will lose the battle. We will lose the war in the long run. That's my view. I think that there is a way of battling that imperial system, which is the opposite of confrontation and demonization. But I stop here. I let you go.
I also want to let's take Alberto's view of the world and talk about how do we get there. That there's some long-term geopolitical economic competition with China. So let's look at home, though. Is the answer for the US more planning, more tariffs, more subsidies? I think Italy is very familiar with planning, tariffs, and subsidies and regulations and what they do to economic growth. The US is getting more and more familiar with that. You really think more of this? Take the super bonus and let's do that again to everything else. That is certainly not how we're going to make our economies better off. The history of maybe the Chinese central planners are so brilliant they've done it, but the history of tariffs, protections, subsidies, industrial policies in the Western world is one of constant economic stagnation. So if we want to win that competition, let's look at home. And why does it take 10 years to get a permit to build anything, both in Italy and in the US? Why are we spending 50% of GDP from the government sending out checks? Why are we paying people not to work? Why are our education systems failing to generate engineers who know how to actually build things? The way to win an economic competition like that is not to try to impoverish China. The way is to look at home and see why our own growth has stagnated. That is, by the way, the economic question. Why did Europe stop growing in 2010? Why is Italy's GDP per capita lower than it was in 2010? Negative growth. That is an enormous disaster. That is not because China is invading and sending us immense amounts of free stuff in return for pieces of paper. That's because we've hobbled our own industries. And competition ought to tell us to fix that. And yes, you want the rest of the world. When we do this sort of thing, we're telling Latin America, choose us or choose China. Well, Latin America, we're asking you to buy $100,000 trucks from GM when BYD can send you $20,000 electric cars that work a lot better. and we're going to throw a tariff on you. And as part of it, you want friends to join your system. Well, reform at home, grow at home is the way to try to win a geopolitical war, not to try to make China go back to a North Korean economy and state. That also is not going to help them politically.
No, listen, you raise many arguments, and we can't. It's very difficult to discuss on all these different topics. The fact is, it's very simple. I think China is bad for the world, and is bad for me, and is bad for democratic countries like Italy, and is bad for democracy. I think it's very simple test you can make. In an American country, you can, if you're an Afghan, you can even dream of becoming CEO. In a Chinese company, you can't. Is the Chinese is only the Chinese.
It's because very few people want to migrate to China.
I think it's a racist culture. It's a racist macho culture, which is not good for the world. And I would fight anything to stop it. And I think that there's a very small element that can allow us to shift production from China to friendly countries. That's as simple as that. We don't need a large discussion to get to this point. But of course, if you think that system, then be my. Of course, things don't work. Is a value that it doesn't have. What can I do? I lived in China. I know what it is like. I've been in Asia for 30 years, so I have an idea, and that's how I got to shape my position. And it's very difficult that based on the discussion that there's anybody right or wrong. I don't try to convince Michele of the opposite. I know that I'm unconvincible because I've seen things that nobody else has ever seen.
But even let's take your view. What you want is that the policies that you enact actually help towards that view. So is it more helpful to guide China towards becoming, do we want a world where China liberalizes as part of the international system, sees that its advantage is both to trade with us and to reform, or do we want to start the war and tell China, you're on your own? And the minute China is on its own, its incentives for not invading Taiwan go way down. So I think
that's a very good point.
Where do we want to go, and how do we want to get there? Putting big tariffs in on China, telling them they're on their own, is likely counterproductive.
We appeased China for many years. Because the assumption underneath was that China would become a liberalized country, would become liberal, would open up, and so on. This hasn't happened. China is much worse than it was 20 years ago.
That's not true.
Much less open than it was.
That's not true. Alberto, I let you believe whatever you want, but making statement like this, that China is much worse than it was 20 years ago, is just not true. It's just plainly not true.
It's pretty bad.
È una chiusura. La Cina è talmente chiusa, ha espulso gli stranieri. Ma vuoi scherzare? È tutto sulla security. La gente scompare dalla sera alla mattina. Michele, ma cosa dici?
No,
la gente non scompare dalla sera alla mattina in Cina.
Non ho alcuna intenzione di andare su questo terreno.
Ma adesso
non ho alcuna intenzione di andare su questo terreno di hearsay.
Allora non venirci. Però questa è la verità, la gente scompare dalla sera alla mattina.
I just contradicted a statement that it's much worse than it was 20 years ago.
Much worse. That you can contradict it forever. I now retract this. China has got much worse. Prior to Xi was a much more open system. You could freely talk. Now there's no longer the case.
I do not think the case rests on
70% of the foreigners. 70% of the foreigners have left China. Even all my foreign friends that were in Shanghai with me, we had a grand time together. All of them have left. They can't stand to be in China anymore.
China's bad. Russia's bad. Human rights are in trouble in many places in the world. I don't see how the argument falls there. If you restrict the ability of people in your country to buy stuff they want from any place that doesn't, come up to your standards, we're all going to be tremendously poor and a more dangerous world because, when countries are all on their own, they're much more likely to lash out. So I just don't think, even if we agree completely on your diagnosis of how terrible things are in China, the policy of lots of tariffs on everything, I think, hurts our own economies more than it's going to hurt China, and is not going to be productive to where we want to end up. And I think I know where we want to end up.
Before, I demonstrated to you that China did very good by applying tariffs. In the 1900s, America applied heavy tariffs. They did very good. So it's not necessarily.
No, we got to stop right there. America in the 1890s had high tariffs, and this is often said, oh, look, high tariffs are wonderful. But there's a question of because or despite. Every study that's looked at it says, no, we in fact did well despite the tariffs, not because of the tariffs. And this is the classic causation versus correlation. Do you really say, oh, we need the economy of America in the 1890s? When average income was 1/10 of what it is now, when women couldn't work, when blacks were slaves, not everything of the 1890s was great, when pollution was rampant. So you can't just cherry pick, oh, we had tariffs, we had growth. Tariffs were great for growth without also taking all the rest of it. So it is absolutely clear that the US prospered despite tariffs, not because of the tariffs in the 1890s.
Well, I still think you still have a case that the U.S. built a very strong industrial base with the tariffs. There's no question about it.
Yes, despite.
In 1820, the British burned the White House because the U.S. didn't know how to defend itself. 8 years go past, and now the situation is reversed.
We also had a large internal market, and the fact is today,
the U.S. the population was growing, the internal market was growing. Come on, there are libraries of Congress of research of economic historians on that fact. The tariffs were not good at all. There is a consensus that goes from left to right on the topic. Let's not use that argument. The argument boils down to a political argument. And so the battle is completely political. People that hold your view have the view that China is, one, the monster system, and they forget others like Iran, like North Korea, like Russia. And two, that in order to stop the monster system from expanding, the best thing to do is to start essentially what will lead to a war. Because it will lead to a war. Because what if this strategy were because the strategy of fighting China every inch of the way can have only two outcomes, and neither of them is desirable. One outcome is actually China wins. That is the way in which it is done rallies other countries around the world, because we're forgetting, the group of people that wants to fight this battle is half of the 350 million people living in the United States of America, and a small percentage of the 400 million people living in Europe. Altogether, I would say 300 million people. There are 8.7 billion people out there, all right, which might decide, and China on this is very good and very subtle, to side with China. So I cannot rule out the fact that they may actually win this particular war. And that would not be good if your hypothesis is correct, because they would be running the world and we would be trapped in a North Atlantic corner. The alternative is that actually they lose. And if they lose, that is, they go back to a kind of a pre-Deng Xiaoping situation, they're going to resemble the Russia of Putin, a country with a potential future, with a potential economic growth, that for a variety of reasons feels that the other guys, the bad guys, cornered them, prevented them from growth, excluded them from the world, and brought them down. And that country will still have a military apparatus. As it often happens, when countries get poorer, the military don't get poorer, they get richer. They come into control. And that's going to maximize the chance of actually an armed conflict. So I mean, I understand it's political, and I understand it's pointless to try to convince each other that China is a monster or not a monster, but I think you should think strategically about these two outcomes of this game.
Yeah,
because
the
that's the
important
key
thing.
part. I'm trying to think rationally about this.
The important thing is, do the tools achieve what you want them to achieve, not just how bad is China.
Yeah, I guess that's the right way to put it. And the
No,
issue, let's
no,
forget how bad China is. Let's just ask, how do you actually contain China's bad aspect? Let's agree that there are many bad aspects. You think they're dominant? You think they are, most of their aspects are bad? I think there are some bad aspects. I don't think they're dominant, but that's okay. Given that we agree on what the bad aspects are, let's ask, how do we control the bad aspect? Right? That should be our attitude. How do we, for example, reduce their influence in Africa?
But also, let's wrap up around where we started.
We need to wrap.
This is about 1/100th of the issues involving Trump's tariff and the ongoing global trade war. It is certainly does not explain anything of what we're doing. There's 15 arguments for tariffs. This is one of the first. And I think where we've gone with this show is, if you take this strategic question seriously, you don't end up with anything like the tariffs that are being put in place, which are also supposedly for
let leave it like that's.
In fact, let me just do a quick
I think on the tariffs, all three of us agree. I think that the issue that
let me just do a quick
is posing is a strategic.
A quick counterproductive. 150% tariffs on everything from China is going to double the price of everything in Walmart. And the support that Michele brought up for anti-China policy is going to evaporate.
I know, John, but I'm not saying the tariff should be 100%. I'm not saying it should be on everything. So it's not the case you make with me. The case is, I would like to stop China, and Michele wouldn't. I don't
think that's the case at all. I think we want effective tools that
I think the
actually
way you have in mind of stopping China is counterproductive.
No, well, I think that we tried to appease China. It didn't work. It got worse. So this is something we discussed already. I think we can end here. It's a value difference. I do not accept a totalitarian country growing and expanding in the world the way it is. I don't like it, and I will always fight it. And China and Russia, to me, there's not much difference there. China is deeply totalitarian. It doesn't spread good practices. It tries to kill democracy wherever it goes. It's very racist, and it tends to foster systems that are based on bribe. It tends to foster bribery, totalitarian, lack of social justice. So I don't like it, but many people who like it. So
I don't think that is not the argument. Neither Michele or I love the Chinese system. We just want policies that are going to actually work towards strengthening.
I haven't heard a single word from you that will. You haven't said a single word that convinced me that you have an idea of what it takes to stop China, John.
I want to strengthen us.
There's nothing in everything you said in an hour that made me ring a bell and says, oh, wow, John knows how to stop China, or Michele does.
I don't think impoverishing China is either practical or desirable.
I didn't say there is a big difference in slowing down or stopping or impoverishing.
Gentlemen, I agree with you. This is extremely interesting, and let me make a proposal. I have to go teach in 20 minutes. We have been at 70 minutes, and we're abusing John's patience, but it's a key point. So Alberto says he wants to stop China. John and I say this is not the way to do it. Let's have, in a few weeks, a discussion on that topic. What is it about China that has to be stopped, and how do we stop it? Because given that we agree that the tariffs are not the way, given that we agree that it's chaos, given that we agree that that's not the right way, where we disagree is on the strategic risk associated to China and the proper way to address it. Well, we may invite a fourth person, maybe a person that has a closer view to Alberto to balance the budget. Well, there is a common friend, that is Fabio Scacciavillani. I think he sees eye to eye with Alberto on this, right, Alberto?
Yes.
Good. So if John is available 2-3 weeks from now, we'll address the issue. What should be the containment approach to whatever we don't like of China? Alberto doesn't like 100%. I don't like 80%, whatever it is. Is that okay?
That'll be fun.
Fantastic.
You have a deal? Let's leave the last word to our guest.
Oh no, this has been great. I think the most important thing is that the current tariffs are not clearly part of a well thought out, multi-decade.
Trump is not the right person to fight China. Trump is not the right person to fight anybody, to fight the bugs in my bedroom. Okay? Trump is not right anyway.
The other conversation we should have is the one where we started on, which is we are in an economic mess, a political mess involving the emerging global trade war, which is being undertaken for 99 reasons having nothing to do with stopping China. And that economic issue is the issue of our time, really.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, then we have 2 meetings. We'll have to find another guest for the second one that John has proposed.
A non-China tariffs meeting.
A non-China tariff. People, our
ECB and inflation and lack of growth in Europe. The Draghi report.
Yeah, we should invite Mario Draghi or maybe Francesco Giavazzi to discuss that with us. It could be fun.
Those are the most important issues right now.
So the people that listen are very happy. One said they got another episode of the Grumpy Economist, but for free. Others said,
always free.
Finally, Alberto and I disagree on something, and vehemently so. And so that's all very interesting, I think, and pleasant. Friends disagree. It happens to be the case. What do you want to do? Life would be very boring otherwise.
Ok, ciao.
Ciao.
Bye bye everybody. Ciao, grazie John, grazie davvero. Ciao Alberto.
Grazie, è stato molto.
Proviamo a dire, ma anche a fare, l'ovvio.